Life isn't perfect, and neither are we.
Nope. But we know how to face our fears
And have some fun,
and talk about all the messiest things of life.
like the messiest things.
Get connected to yourself, get connected to others, and get connected to the life right in front of you.
This is The Connected Life with Justin and Abby.
That's me.
That's you.
And you.
Living Fully Live 2024. It's happening. It's happening right now. March 13th. We are about to close in on Living Fully Live.
You know what I love about it is, so this year we decided not to do it in January because everybody is doing their self-help, change your life, transform your life in January. And by March, they've all forgotten all of the things that they wanted to change or do. And now they're just in the busyness of life and they've forgotten. And
Or
so
they
we
tapped
thought,
out and gave up. They're like,
Yeah.
this isn't going to happen.
too hard. And so we were like, let's be like a little bit mid-year inspiration. Like
Ooh.
find yourself again, reconnect. I just love the intentionality of taking care of yourself. Being like, I'm going to purposely do something to connect to my heart, to be more present with myself, to give, to make me a priority. Because then you handle the things that are happening to you and all around you so much differently.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
Well, it's great. We have the immersion program. I think that I have absolutely loved that. And we've talked about it before because I'm watching people go through a process of getting live transformation. Like it's happening right in front of you, and it's happening in front of a group of people. And what you watch are people falling in love is like, not in a romantic way, but you watch their hearts like go, oh, I love you.
Oh.
With each individual as people start sharing vulnerably about their stories and stuff. And you watch this impact where all of a sudden they're like, no, I'm not just here watching your story. I now want to be part of your story. I want to help carry the load with you. And I've watched these deep bonds form with people inside of Living Fully Alive that then emerged into people eventually being in our life consulting masterclass together and all of that. And
well, even this morning, one of our friends was talking about their parent has cancer and they're walking through the process.
yeah.
And they were saying they're doing something they've never done before, which is they have a few guys that they are messaging updates of what's going on and then also how they're feeling. But it's guys they met in LFA.
Yeah.
And who are also on the same page, who care about emotional health and I can't tell you how many people have told me they found their best friend, their tribe, because something magical happens when vulnerability enters into a space. So much of the science right now is showing that addiction decreases when connection increases.
Yeah.
Because the human soul is starving for connection and belonging. And so it's this amazing thing when vulnerability enters into a room. And so a lot of times in Living Fully Alive or any of the courses that we do in our immersion programs, we have spaces where we create a safe enough space that people can be vulnerable. And what happens is when you're vulnerable, people rush in to meet you.
Right.
Like there is something so endearing and addictive actually about engaging someone when they're being vulnerable.
Yeah.
Vulnerability is like the glue of connection. It's the thing that forms the deepest felt sense of connection, I think.
Yeah. Which, our conversation today is about vulnerability.
Yeah. We're not just talking about living fully alive forever.
No. It's all about vulnerability. It is something that is an amazing on-ramp into understanding yourself enough that you can begin to become vulnerable. And it's a great, safe place to practice being vulnerable with other people. So you can go to Justin and Abby, that's abi.com, if you want to check out Living Fully Alive 2024 and get enrolled now with us. But going to the vulnerability conversation that we're having today, I do want to start off with saying, Brene Brown, I want to talk about her real quick, only because I think it's fascinating that it took someone bringing like science to the conversation for people to buy in. Like people in the emotional health world were sitting there being like, yeah, vulnerability changes everything.
Yeah.
Watch it with all my clients. And people are like, yeah, but does it? But does it?
Oh, totally. 100%.
I'm pretty
People
sure I don't need
so
that.
against it.
You're all a bunch of kooks and quacks. But what happened was when she started having this dialogue, a quick quick TED talk saying, here's some science. And people are like, scientifically, it's real, so we can trust this now.
Yes.
But I love that she was a tipping point, right?
100%.
For the world to decide this is something worth looking at. Because for years, vulnerability had been branded as weakness.
Yes.
And Brene Brown comes in and rebrands vulnerability as actually a strength.
Yes.
And so I love the gift that she gave to us as far as the ability to communicate freely and be the tip of the spear that's breaking the walls down and everything and actually creating a common conversation inside of humanity that's acceptable to have.
Yeah. And I think vulnerability is such an interesting subject. I've been on my own journey with it. As everybody is, because I think all of these things, you can get in the habit of being vulnerable and then you can just get busy and forget to do it. Like, it's very easy to just do normal life and not have those moments where you actually lean into vulnerability and sharing. So I thought we could both talk about our own journeys a little bit about how we learned about vulnerability and what it was like for us.
Yeah.
I remember for me, when we started speaking publicly, everybody thought I was so vulnerable because I was so honest. And I think growing up in the transparency, I was so transparent, and people are like, oh my gosh, she's saying things I've never heard anyone say before, because it felt really comfortable for me to talk about my self-hatred or my shame or my panic attacks, or I was able to give language. But what people didn't realize is I was always talking about the past. I was never talking about something present that I was struggling with, or I was rarely. And I was sharing things that didn't feel vulnerable to me. I wasn't scared. I remember people being like, thank you so much for being vulnerable. You're so brave. And on the inside, I'd be like, I don't remember feeling brave.
Yeah.
And now I can say it's because it wasn't. That's just a natural part. I'm happy to be honest and transparent about a lot of things.
Yeah.
Vulnerability is something different to me. Vulnerability isn't just honest information. It's sharing something about myself that I either want to hide or that I'm scared you'll judge me for, or even feeling the feelings that I've judged as weak. A lot of vulnerability to me is connected to my personal judgments of weakness.
Yeah.
So if I think that dreaming too big is weak, then I don't want to share with you a dream that could be too big. Or if I think feeling shame is weak, then I'm not going to share with you that I feel shame over something.
I think one of the aspects of that as well is that a lot of times there are certain needs that we have. And we can look at those and say, hey, it's weak to have this. So I had, can I add a little bit of my own story? I had a lot of judgment about letting people help me and take care of me. And I believe that people who needed help and care were very weak. And so the minute, someone would be like, can I help you? Whether it's carrying groceries, right? That felt vulnerable. I didn't have language for vulnerability though inside of that. I'd be like, no, I don't. I got this. I don't need your help. I'm not weak.
Yeah.
But then to all of a sudden be like, sure, you can carry part of the load right here. And that you can take that from groceries all the way into help doing taxes and taking care of finances, or help processing an emotion, or help teaching me, trying to learn something. There were so many aspects of life that I guarded myself from by judging them as weaknesses. And what I really did is I did a detriment of taking care of my own soul inside of it. Because vulnerability is actually an on-ramp to care.
Yeah, to getting the love that you need.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so what you were sharing is when you didn't want to look weak, it's like putting a hand out to love.
Totally.
You can't
Every
love
time.
me because I don't want to look weak. Instead of allowing the love that was being offered to you an ability to impact you. And this is why vulnerability transforms our lives, is because it opens us up to love. And love is the most healing, powerful, addictive feeling on the planet.
It really is.
And so when we're not vulnerable, people can't get in close to love us.
Right. Which goes to, I don't want you to hurt me. Right. And a lot of the narrative inside of my head was like, if I allow you close to me, you're going to use this against me somehow. And you're going to use it against me to destroy me.
Right.
And there was a deep mistrust of what humanity would do with my vulnerability, which I think is universal for a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's pretty universal that we have that. And it also goes into thinking, you'll either hurt me with it or you're going to use this against me. I used to have what I called like an emotional bank account. And in that bank account, like if you do something for me, I am now in debt in my bank account.
Absolutely.
So if you've taken care of me, now I'm in a posture of owing someone. So I couldn't receive love freely. So it felt very vulnerable to allow people to love me and give into me, whatever that giving into looked like.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I don't believe that I'm worthy of this. And now I have to pay the penance back. I have to pay the debt back somehow.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I think a lot of people have that belief system that they owe people, and so they don't want to receive.
And so me deciding that I don't owe people, like that was a massive vulnerable thing to do, to go like, I'm going to let you love me right now. And I'm going to make the decision that I don't owe you anything on the other side of this.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to receive this freely. But then that takes me deciding that I'm worthy of that gift that's being freely given. And that feels vulnerable.
It feels so vulnerable to receive love in any way. It is that, am I worthy of this? I remember even sometimes like people just buying us a meal when we were younger.
Oh my gosh.
It would trigger all of my like, I'm unworthy. I owe you something. I need to love you really well. I need to make sure that we're like, I need to pay off the burden that I just was.
Yeah.
And so it's so true that receiving love freely can feel wildly out of control. And I often think of vulnerability is the opposite of control. Or the opposite of self-protection. So like self-protection is like, I'm in charge, like I'm in control. And vulnerability is like, I am more surrendered.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm going to let you love me versus I'm going to earn your love.
Yeah. Again, that goes back to, you're talking about earning love inside of that versus just freely receiving love. And this idea that, again, I'm going to have to believe that I don't have to earn it is really, I'm going to have to risk on the idea that I am worthy.
Yes.
That there is something good about me. Again, that's something that feels terrifying.
Yeah, it's so true. I want to add to it, but I think that's just a really good, it's so true. Risking on the idea that we're worthy. And obviously when somebody loves me well, I want to love them back. So it's not like, that's a natural reciprocation, but it's different than feeling like I owe somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really is.
I think for me, a lot of vulnerability, one of my biggest beliefs was that to be powerful in life is to be unaffectable. Like the whole goal is to be unaffectable. So like if somebody hurts me, being like, it's fine, I'm fine.
That's
like,
a good point.
Or like if something bad happens, like, it's okay, I got it. It's fine. I'll be fine. Like pretty much like my idea is like, I should be able to never feel affected. That's what being powerful is.
Yeah.
So obviously this has been hard even in our marriage. Like in the past few years is the first time I think I've learned to be. Now I was vulnerable about, I want to make it like, there's lots of ways we were vulnerable with each other.
Yes, there are many.
There were. But there were lots of ways I didn't know how to be vulnerable. I didn't know how to be vulnerable around this idea of I'm fine. And so there were things where I felt lots of vulnerable emotions. Like I felt rejected by things.
Yeah.
But like I couldn't even let myself feel rejection. Like that's not an emotion I allow myself to feel. It's an intolerable. We all have intolerable emotions. We avoid them at all costs.
Yes.
Because it feels too vulnerable even within ourselves to feel them.
Yep.
So part of my journey with vulnerability has been to allow myself to feel the vulnerable feeling, like to recognize. So instead I would have just gotten mad at you. I would just be mad. That's not a vulnerable emotion.
No, that's one that's widely accepted.
Yeah.
And it's also not a root emotion.
Totally.
Like, and it's not a bad emotion, but it's not usually the root one. Like, oh, I feel really judged. I feel really abandoned. I feel really rejected. Like, these are more root things. And we go into these protectors of madness or anger.
I'm going to judge you so I don't have to feel judged. I'm going to get mad at you for that thing you did instead of actually say, hey, like a great example would be like if you ate dinner and didn't tell me, I'd be mad at you about it.
Yeah, you just come at me with anger.
Like, why would you do that? Or confusion for me. Why would you eat dinner without me? That feels like a bummer. Instead of being like, oh, actually, I think I feel hurt. I actually think I feel sad. Like, I was looking forward to connecting with you. And I actually think I feel a little bit rejected. But I hated the idea of feeling rejected so much.
And acknowledging it.
Or hurt.
Yeah.
Even just having hurt feelings felt so bad because my whole goal was to be unaffectable. Like, it's fine. It's fine. Whatever. I'm fine. I'm fine, but you're an idiot. You know what I mean? That's what I did a lot.
I remember I may have shared about this a little bit, but there was a moment of violence that I was experiencing as a child. And as it was happening to me, I previously had cried a lot in moments like that. And I decided my tears don't matter and they cost me something.
Yeah.
And in that moment, I said, I will never cry again. And I will not allow you to see how you affect me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I all of a sudden turned the waterworks off. And I remember a numbness overtaking me. And from that point forward, there was a sense that my power was in the idea of what you're talking about, which is I'm unaffectable. You can't hurt me.
I'm fine.
I had this idea that I don't give a shit what you do.
Totally.
In fact, I will do whatever you're doing 10 times worse back to you if you really want it.
Yeah.
Like, I'll give it back if that's what we need to do, but you're not going to affect me anymore. And that's something you're talking about, something that is very relatable. That is a survival skill.
Absolutely.
To save ourselves, but that's for surviving, not thriving.
Well, and I'd say a lot of times the families we grew up in, vulnerability wasn't safe.
Right. And it didn't mean that there had to be violence.
Sure.
A lack of safety could have been we got mocked.
Yeah, like sarcasm.
Taunted, sarcasm that hit us. I know that people have been, it's funny because people have been frustrated before at times where we've been sarcastic with each other.
Totally.
Because it's a trigger for them, because it's a pain point, because they actually experienced places where sarcasm cut them, shut them down, and remove the ability for them to be vulnerable. So it could be sarcasm. It could be also pleasantries.
Yeah.
So it could be a household that's like, we're happy plastic people.
We never say anything hard. We never do anything.
It's all going to be okay. Yeah. It's good.
Or we just invalidate it with get over it.
Or do you know you have to look at the good things in life?
Yeah.
Here are the good things that happen. And you're like, okay, I'm non-affectable moving forward.
Yep.
It's too terrible. It hurts too bad to be vulnerable and share this part of myself with you, only to have you turn around and somehow dismiss it, shut it down, mock it, and act out in certain ways. So
yeah, it's very courageous to start to go against the grain of what we learned was safe or unsafe. And sometimes you meet new friends, like in different friend groups, different things are allowed.
Yeah.
And so in some friend groups, maybe it does feel safe to share you're having a bad day. In other friend groups, maybe it feels safe to feel like, I know I have different friend groups now that I'm not vulnerable with all my friend groups. Some of my friend groups are like, we just have fun and we laugh at stuff and we talk about good stuff.
Yeah.
Like I have a lot of friends that I'm not vulnerable with.
Yeah.
And I feel comfortable there. Like this is something that people, when you start to talk about vulnerability, they go into a panic. They're like, I don't want to be vulnerable with everyone. Yeah, you shouldn't be.
No.
You definitely shouldn't be vulnerable.
Not everyone is worthy of your vulnerability.
But I also think it's not a vulnerable or not vulnerable. I think there's 10 stages in there.
Yeah. There's levels of it.
Yeah. And this one always surprises me because I'll ask questions. I'll ask something that feels like a connection questions. So something that could evoke something deep. And people will get stuck sometimes because they think they either have to share the deepest thing about themselves or nothing at all. And I'm always like, I have like 10 options. Like if you ask me how am I have like 10 options for just that, which is a
How are you, Abby?
Basic question, right? And I have 10 variations. So like if I don't know you very well, I'm going to be like, I'm doing pretty good. Like I got dressed today and I'm in a good mood because that is true.
Yeah.
If there's a little bit deeper, I might be like, you know what? I'm processing through a lot of things. If we wanted to go more vulnerable, I might be like, oh, I'm doing, there's things I feel really good about, but also today I started my period and I don't feel great. And I'm processing some pretty big PTSD triggers that I still have.
Yeah.
And then if we wanted to go deeper, I would say what those PTSD triggers were, or I would say exactly how I feel in this exact moment. So
or you might even go further and just start sob crying right on the spot.
Yeah, which is beautiful.
Hold me.
Yes, I need love. But the idea is that I can choose with each person.
Yeah.
And the goal is not that I have to be vulnerable with every single person. I can be honest. I can be transparent. And I can choose to share the things that feel safe within that relationship group. So I have friends that are just fun friends, but I don't get super fulfilled by those relationships because being known is what bonds you to somebody. Being able to contribute to their life and being able to have them contribute to yours is what bonds you with people.
Yeah. We were watching the latest season of Love is Blind the other night. And this one dude
this year we're going to do a recap. We should start doing YouTube recaps after every episode.
That would be kind of fun, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So one dude is just kind of like having a meltdown because the girl that he's into is kind of into another guy. And as he's in the middle of the meltdown, you're talking about us not allowed, like being in spaces where friend groups don't make space for that or whatever. And as he's kind of having his meltdown, this other dude's like, yeah, things will be what they'll be, you know, and I guess it's all going to work out, and sort of that attitude, and completely shut down any space for the vulnerability to exist within it. He didn't know what to do with it or anything like that.
Yeah.
But it's so common that a lot of people don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about the cultures.
Is vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. So you're talking about cultures that don't create the space for it. And like, we have to decide what level we're at. We also have to understand, like, people don't know what to do with vulnerability. And sometimes if we...
Not everybody. Some people do.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's plenty of people that don't know what to do with it. And so when people don't know what to do with it, there's a place of being able to even assess, oh, is this something that they even have the capacity for?
Right.
And a lot of times we don't investigate, does this person have the capacity for this? And then we get really hurt and shut down and go, well, it was pointless for me to have vulnerability in the first place because I opened up and it didn't get handled well. So why should I ever do this? Instead of being like, was that the right place, the right time? Did I set the person up for success for that situation?
Yes.
Right?
You know what we've had to do in our marriage a lot is start to be like, is this a good time to be vulnerable?
Yes.
Because so many times I would just open up something, but you'd be in the middle of something, or you'd have somewhere you had to go, or you had a lot on your mind. And so you would
I'd get sideswiped.
You would not respond well because you'd be frustrated or focused on whatever you're doing. And so now what I've learned to do with all of my friends is like, hey, I can tell I have some stuff going on. I'd love to share it with you and be vulnerable. Is this a good time for that? And that signals to people, do I have the capacity to be with you in whatever you share? And sometimes you say no.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Well, that's one of the things that I think that if we're going to help foster a culture of vulnerability, not just in how I'm vulnerable with you, but also when people are being vulnerable with me, I have to be honest about my capacities.
Yes.
Because that creates trust.
Yes.
Because if I can look at you when you're like, hey, I'm in a really vulnerable moment, can I share this? And I know myself well enough to know my head's in another place. My emotions are in another place.
Or I'm tired. I don't feel good.
Yeah. Me being able to say like, hey, I want to be able to meet you in this, but in this moment, I can tell I won't be able to meet you well.
Yeah.
That and saying like, if you need, I would love to circle back at another time, or you can talk to somebody else about it. But in the future, I would love for you to be able to continue to come to me. That's covering all the basis. Yep. And that says this is a safe relationship to do vulnerability. And lastly, if I do that well and say no well, it means my yes comes out well.
Yes.
Because I'm not in the middle of a yes that I didn't have capacity for, thinking about either how much I hate it, or my brain's in some other world on something else I have to take care of, or my emotions are already spun out and I'm not being able to engage in compassion and kindness and whatever. And so really the message that I send when I say yes, when I don't have capacity and I need to say no, is that I really don't care about your vulnerability. Totally. That might not be true about how I feel, but that's the message that ends up landing for people.
And we had so many times where that's how it felt for me. I would come to share something and you would be focused, or you'd be sick, or there'd be something going on, and then you wouldn't respond well. And then I'd just leave hurt, and then we do that cycle. And I actually never feel rejected now when you say I don't have capacity, because now I feel loved, because I'm like, yeah, I will hate it if I share this vulnerable thing with you and you can't be kind.
Well, I had a narrative in my head that if I don't show up vulnerably, or show up to meet her in her vulnerability right now,
she'll stop being vulnerable.
Not only that, but it means that I'm not a good husband and I'm not a good friend, and that I'm failing her right now.
Right.
So I actually created a trap for myself that perpetuated the very thing that I didn't want to happen.
And then I was so mad.
Yeah.
About it, because all the time you'd say, like, you'd be in a conversation with me, I thought you have the capacity to be present, and then you wouldn't be able to.
Yeah. I think the other thing is that I do want to add a nuance to that, is there are times that I said yes, not aware of my capacity. And I think that there are a lot of people that like, they truly believe in that moment to what they can tell inside, I can do this.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've learned how to do is see my way out of these moments healthfully when I realize I can't do them any longer.
Yeah.
So that's looked like me being able to be like, hey, I know I said I could do this, and I'm realizing that actually my blood sugar is crashing, or I have an overwhelm internally.
Can I hug you and hold you for a few minutes, and then can we come back to this?
Yep. Can we start to pivot and find more? Because I do want to take care of you. And so even if that feels difficult as you've opened up, at least me pivoting deliberately is better than waiting till the plane crashes and burns altogether, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because that has changed our marriage, really. Both of us, you asking if I have the capacity.
Yes.
And sometimes I just honestly, my brain is spinning on something else and it just can't come down in that moment. And oftentimes we'll ask, like, is this something that is urgent, or could you share it with me later? Because there's some things you need to process right then, but there's some things that it doesn't really matter. You can share it later. Sometimes you're in the emotion right then and it'd be helpful, but oftentimes it's not. I think that has really helped our marriage.
I think it's saved our marriage in a lot of aspects, because
it's allowed us to both be tender. Because you know when you have the capacity to be compassionate and when you don't. And I need compassion when I'm being vulnerable.
Again, that takes an immense amount of self-awareness, which is something, again, a lot of people don't have. And it's not bad. We just don't have self-awareness. We have to do a self-discovery. Yeah. You know, it's one of the things that we talk about in Living Fully Alive is self-awareness. It's one of our foundation points inside of it, because we're trying to help people establish an understanding of themselves, because once I know that, I can bring the reality of that to the table in the world around me. And that opens up a whole lot of connection, and it creates understanding. Once I can understand me, I help other people understand me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it starts solving a lot of the questions, because a lot of times what happens is, if I don't know how to communicate what's going on inside of here, then you're left to make up whatever ideas about me that you want. And so these moments of vulnerability, you end up walking away, if I don't know about me, going like, I just know he doesn't care about me. He doesn't love me. That didn't matter to him right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I also think vulnerability has changed our marriage a lot in how we share our feelings.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize like vulnerable confrontation is very different than confrontation.
Yes.
Vulnerable conflict is very different than conflict. And you know, I had so many protectors in conflict and so many ways to deflect or be powerful or not be vulnerable, because that's kind of the goal. When you feel hurt, what do you want to do? You want to not be vulnerable.
Yes. And that's sensible.
Yeah, it makes sense. And so I have had to learn how to connect to my vulnerable feelings and connect to my vulnerable. So oftentimes it's like, what am I afraid of? Or what do I feel rejected by? Those are the two vulnerable things that I normally have to ask myself. I don't feel rejection very easily. I don't feel fear that fast. Typically,
doesn't mean they're not there immediately.
No.
You just don't connect with them that quickly.
I connect to anger or confusion or frustration or like, that's not logical. Like those things are the quickest things to connect to for me.
Yeah.
Or at least in the past they have been. I think I'm faster now than I've ever been. But I've had to, the way that I've learned is to be like, okay, underneath this, what am I afraid of, or what do I feel rejected by? What am I afraid of, or what do I feel rejected by? And then learning how to actually share that with you instead. Because here's what I've noticed. If in conflict, I'm sharing about you, you'll immediately get on defense. Anybody. It's not about me and you specifically. Anytime I confront somebody and I tell them about them.
To give an example of maybe.
Wouldn't that be a good idea?
Telling me about me. How about
okay.
You don't care?
Oh, that's the one I was going to say.
You're not thoughtful.
You don't care about me because of blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
Because you didn't want to hang out last night.
Mm-hmm.
You don't care about me. Versus, hey, I could tell. And now I purposely try to not be level 10 vulnerable in conflict either, because if I get too vulnerable, I will snap. And I will snap back with aggression.
Yeah.
So I try to do like vulnerable language, but not overwhelming vulnerability. So that would be like, hey, I can tell I really wanted to connect with you last night and that I'm feeling like sad that we didn't get to. And I wanted to share that.
And you might even say something like, oh, it might be helpful to hear your thoughts about me.
Yeah.
You know, especially if you're closer to someone. I mean, enough that this is happening. Like, it might be helpful for me to hear about how you feel about hanging out with me, and maybe if you like spending time with me or would want to be spending time with me. It helped me to hear that. That is a vulnerable thing to say, right?
Yeah, but it's so helpful, and it actually becomes less vulnerable the more you do it. That's what I've learned. The more I use I language, the less vulnerable it feels. The more I have needs, the less vulnerable they feel. Like the intense panic vulnerable feeling goes down the more you make something a habit. And so I think it's important for people to know.
The consistency of habitually communicating in that way doesn't feel so vulnerable.
Yeah. The longer I do a healthy, vulnerable skill, the less I feel that intense, vulnerable panic.
Yeah.
And so people get scared because the first few times, maybe the first time you try having a need. I remember when I started sharing needs in marriage, it was crazy to me to say, hey, I'd really love it if you could listen to this thing I want to share. Or, hey, I'd really love it if we could spend some time together later. Like just saying a need felt so vulnerable.
That's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
No, because I'm right here being like, that was vulnerable?
Oh my God.
I had no idea.
Yeah, totally.
That's not something that was ever communicated.
Oh yeah. Well, and that's a great point. A lot of times we're being vulnerable or other people are being vulnerable and we don't even know it. So like it would be really vulnerable for me to have a need because I believed I should have no needs. And I believed if you were going to meet them, you should just mind read them. Like in the beginning of our marriage, the idea of having to tell you, I need compassion now, felt so out of control because then you could choose to give it or not.
Yeah.
That felt so scary. But then you practice saying that over and over again. And now I don't even think about it. It's not even hard for me to say like, oh, I need some compassion. Do you have that to give? Like it actually feels unvulnerable.
Yeah.
Because we've created a new normal. And so what I want to tell people is the more you create a culture and the more you do habits, it actually expands your territory for things to feel less vulnerable. So a good example was I have a friend who we were having a conversation and they're like, hey, I can tell right now I'm scared you're judging me for what I'm sharing. Well, I've done that before. And the first time I did it, that felt really scary to say. It felt like overwhelming and like, oh gosh, now I'm being more vulnerable, letting them know that I'm scared of what they think about me. But then you do it a few times and the other person's like, oh, that's actually really easy for me. You know, I have a friend who's very quiet when I share. And so I will have to ask afterwards, like, hey, can you let me know what you're thinking? Because especially if it's vulnerable, I don't feel covered by the silence. I feel
like I did that a lot.
You were silent with me?
Yeah, early on in marriage.
Yeah.
But which is an interesting thing, right? You felt really vulnerable in it. And I felt like I was like loving you really well.
By being silent?
Well, by being quiet and engaged and contemplative. Like I was sitting really trying to just hold space. Like this person needs to talk a lot. But there was this idea that there was something that you needed to get out of you. And I didn't want to be someone that like interrupted or showed a sign of disrespect by talking into it. Like, no, I'm holding sacred space by just being a good listener.
Yeah.
And being like, thank you for sharing. But you're like, tell me more, like talk into this. I'm like, I don't know what you want me to say. I was just in listening mode, taking care of your heart.
Totally. But so my normal response is to start, like, let's say I'm sharing something vulnerable and somebody's silent. I start to feel uncomfortable, and my uncomfortable emotions typically will send me towards frustration or, because I can only stay in hurt for so long. And I think most people are like that. We can only tolerate scary emotions, whatever we've decided is scary. So I can tolerate rejection way more now than I could a year ago, because now I can look at it and hold it and feel it. And I don't feel like it's bad. I judged rejection as weak my whole life. So once I noticed that, I was able to be like, okay, well, rejection isn't weak. Every human feels it. And then when I started transforming my idea of it, it got less and less vulnerable. But I'm not great at holding it. Yeah. But I'm better at holding it. So what I'm saying is shame or rejection or abandonment, whatever we can't tolerate, if we're in a conversation and you don't respond to me and it starts to feel like I'm being abandoned in the conversation, that feeling of abandonment starts to grow and grow and grow. And as soon as I can't tolerate it, I just switch. I either shut off and like completely change the subject, or I get frustrated, or I judge you and wall off on you, instead of there being the very simple, the vulnerable thing of like, hey, can you tell me what's going on that you're thinking? Now, originally asking for that felt so vulnerable. And this is what I love, is that vulnerability like actually creates courage, where it gets easier and easier. And so now I can say, hey, can you tell me what you're thinking? That doesn't even feel vulnerable. That just feels like a normal thing to do.
Yeah. You know, when you were sharing about that, I was thinking about what are some of the other reasons that we keep from being vulnerable? It sparked this whole thought in my head. And I thought about how oftentimes we get criticized and judged for the information we're about to share. And those are a couple of emotions that probably are intolerable emotions when you feel that happening, right?
Oh, being judged is the worst.
And criticized. So I was thinking about how people will critically break down everything that's said, which is, this was probably sparked by when you were talking about like feeling so abandoned and on the other side of me not saying anything, because there can be the swirl of like, what is it that you're thinking inside of you? What decisions have you made about my vulnerability? How are you feeling about this? How do you perceive this? Wanting to be reassured, like, I'm not criticizing you. Totally. I'm not judging you in my head. Like what you're sharing, I'm with you on this.
It makes
I care about you. Totally.
I feel sad that you're experiencing this. I feel compassion question for you.
Right. So one of the things that I had to conclude within myself on that note is that I'm going to be criticized, and that's okay. And I'm going to be judged, and that's okay. Like, that's something that for me, I had to work through myself in my story in order to continue being vulnerable, because the fear is these things are going to happen.
And you're like, actually, these things might happen, and
Yes.
I can survive that.
Correct. I can survive it. I can adjust. I can address those things when they do happen. I can be powerful inside of that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just thinking about when you shared that, I had a friend say, "What are you thinking about me? I'm scared you're judging me." And I was like, I might be. Like, in the moment, what they said, I was like, well, I'm actually really wrestling with trying to understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm trying to suspend judgment, but it's confusing me a little bit because of this thing and this thing. And they didn't get mad that I had judgment. They felt excited that we could talk through it.
Right.
Because then they got to have a voice where the areas they felt misunderstood. And I got to have a voice about the areas that felt confusing for me about what they were sharing. And so it wasn't even that I didn't like lie and be like, no, I just feel, I mean, I said a few, like, I can tell you that I care about you and I care about this. There are some things that I'm struggling to understand. It sounds like you're saying you lied here. And I'm struggling to understand that. But I want to understand you more. So let's talk about it. You know, the idea of like being able to go back and forth in the dialogue and communicate, but the vulnerability of asking just breaks down the walls that we would have just silently built up towards each other. They would have built up like, oh, they were judging me. I shouldn't share this stuff with them. And they probably wouldn't have shared stuff with me in the future. I would have built up walls of like, oh, I guess they lied and that doesn't feel safe, instead of us being able to communicate through it.
I was thinking about a lot of relationships on that note, that we're talking close friendships, marriages, partnerships that lack vulnerability inside of it. And a lot of times there's a mountain of history that gives reason. It may not be justifiable, but it gives reason for why they're at the crossroad of not being able to be vulnerable. And I was thinking about like, what would it take to establish vulnerability inside of those relationships? And I think that one of it, you were talking about the dialogue, having the open dialogue about the unsaid things. And I think that there's a lot of things that are left unsaid that need to be said in order to initiate vulnerability within these more intimate primary connections, right? So that looks like, to me, being able to come and say like, hey, I know there's probably an unspoken level of we're not being very vulnerable here. And I can see that there's probably a few breakdowns that I'm aware of that would cause at least me to shut down, in ways that I've done life that I live shut down, or I live guarded, or let me tell you about what's gone on inside of me that's probably fostered a lack of vulnerability on my side. And I would love to understand what's going on inside of you that may have perpetuated a lack of vulnerability in this.
On your side. Yeah, I think that's a great introduction for how do we take this relationship. And even a great question is like, how do you feel like we do with vulnerability in this relationship?
Oh yeah, curiosity.
Do you feel safe to be vulnerable with me? What are ways that I can make our friendship, our relationship feel safer for you to be vulnerable? One thing that I think
I do want to add to that.
Yeah. Okay.
The question also exists, what does vulnerability look like to you?
Oh yeah, because there's so many times I ask my friends to label their vulnerability, because my friends will share something and I'll have no idea that was vulnerable. Because to me, it wouldn't be vulnerable.
Totally.
Maybe they'll share that they went to the doctor and they were really scared about the appointment, but then it went fine. And I'll be like, oh, great. Sounds like a resolved story to me. You know what I mean? And but maybe to them, they're sharing something that feels so vulnerable because to them, that's weakness. To me, it's not weakness.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, oh yeah, everybody gets scared about doctors' things and I'm so glad it worked out okay. But for them, maybe that is them showing that they're not just fine all the time, or that they have a thing that they don't like about themselves. Because a lot of times our vulnerability people have no idea that it's happening. So I ask people, can you label when you're being vulnerable so that I know to give it extra care and attention?
Well, and it's not just that, it's defining it, because there's different definitions in people's minds of what vulnerability is. And that just dialogue about like, oh, I think conversations about health are vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And the other person's like, that's not a vulnerable thing to me whatsoever.
Absolutely.
Conversations about sexuality are vulnerable for me.
Mm-hmm.
Not at all for me. Letting you come and hold me is super vulnerable. You know, that's not vulnerable to me. And it's that back and forth of getting aware of like, define that word. What is vulnerability to you? Not just what are the circumstances, but how do you see it? How do you feel about the word vulnerability? You know?
Yeah. Just starting to have the conversation, and you'll know it. Like if there's a desire to go deeper, like something I've learned is superficial relationships. I love it. They're good. They're good for like enjoying
so glad
life.
I have some of those. Yeah.
Me too. However, there's like a feeling that you'll start to feel of like, it's just a little bit empty.
Yeah.
It just feels a little bit empty. Vulnerability grounds relationships. It creates a really healthy, secure attachment. Vulnerability creates a place when you're vulnerable and someone's vulnerable back, that creates such security, that creates such connection. And vulnerability is contagious. This is why we love our programs, because we create an atmosphere that is safe. We create ground rules about how we treat each other and how we view each other's stories. And then we start and somebody's vulnerable. And once one person opens up with vulnerability, it's contagious. I've seen it in every small group I lead, in every online group we lead. Once one person opens up and people see, oh, it's safe, they got loved, or you feel it. We just were on a trip, and we had one person, we were kind of just sharing about what had impacted us from the trip. And one person, it was so beautiful and powerful. They just opened up. They just let us see all of the things that they were feeling and ashamed of and processing. And they let themselves get emotional.
Oh my gosh.
And they hate feeling feelings in front of people. They hate articulating about feelings in front of people. And they were sharing their deepest fears that they had been encountering that week. And for the whole room, like it was like the air got sucked out in an amazing way. It was like the whole room there was like hush, peace, holiness that just washed over. I was going to say, it felt
like a holy moment that happened as everyone collectively was like, you just gave us a piece of your heart. It's not just you shared it, you like handed it to us and said, here, I will allow you to partake in a piece of my being.
I'll allow you to see me.
Yeah.
I'll allow you to see something that you don't typically get to see and participate. And it was electric. I mean, everybody felt so moved. I think we all cried with, and they got to experience breakthrough because vulnerability beats shame. They got to say all of these things that they were afraid of or they were ashamed of, and we were able to just love back. And then the next person who shared was so vulnerable after that. Like they went vulnerable too, because that it just initiates. There's actually a thing inside of you. Sometimes I've been in groups where once one person shares vulnerably, it's like the people who started sharing want to share again because they're like, oh, I could share something real.
Yeah.
I could share something real about myself, something true about myself, something. And once you see that it's safe, once one person shares and it works out well, it pulls everyone into it. That's why often in a group, if I can, I'll try to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
That invites people into that vulnerability with me.
I wanted to add one other aspect to this vulnerability conversation that keeps standing out to me. You know, we're having a lot of dialogue about the vulnerability with other people, but there's a vulnerability that happens within us that we have to begin to be aware of. And you were talking at some level about one of those aspects is intolerable emotions, right?
Oh my gosh.
If I actually,
for me to just feel rejection was so vulnerable in the beginning, just to feel it, then to tell somebody, that felt like the worst, most intolerable thing.
Yeah. And to me, one of the things for for me has been admitting to myself hopes that I have and dreams that I have.
Yes.
And that's something that I wanted to address. That's one aspect of these things, only because I think that a lot of people, like for me to say, oh, this is what I want my future to look like. These are the experiences that I want to have inside of my life. These are the things that I want to build. Saying that to myself feels terrifying.
Oh, totally.
And there's this ongoing experience internally that a lot of us have that is incredibly vulnerable and actually keeps us gridlocked. We're so scared of vulnerability with ourselves that there's parts of our heart that we live a life running from, unwilling to explore.
Yeah.
Right. And so I use that as one example, but there's many other areas like hopes and dreams of like, what kind of life do I want to live? What do I want for a family?
What do I want for a future? What do I want for a career? I can't tell you, that feels like one of the most vulnerable things for lots of people to share. Now, there's some people that they just are dream and vision machines.
Yeah.
And it's not vulnerable for them at all. They're like, I have these 30 dreams. I'll tell you all of them.
Yeah. Then there's something about celebrating oneself is an aspect that I was thinking as we were talking. I'm like, oh my gosh, early on, I felt so vulnerable and no one else knew that that vulnerable experience was happening.
Totally.
As I started to get excited and celebrate beautiful aspects of my life.
Having a birthday, having a win. Yes.
Yeah. And it didn't even have to be outwardly. It could be an inward conversation where I'm like, I'm proud of myself that I was able to accomplish this thing in my world, and to let down my relationship with self-hatred and self-judgment. Again, no one may know it's happening, but it's happening within me.
Yeah.
Felt terrifyingly vulnerable. But what it did, my inability to be vulnerable with myself was actually stifling my ability to move forward inside of my life. It was stifling my ability to outwardly actively dream and take on new challenges. It was stifling my ability to love myself, which meant it stifled my ability to show up confident and powerful inside of circumstances. I felt so vulnerable acknowledging the destructive things that I had done to hurt other people, like healthfully look honestly into the mirror and be like, dude, I really messed this up.
I know.
And what it did is it stifled my inability to be vulnerable with like, no, I effed this up.
Yeah.
Stifled my ability to repair relationships, and it stifled my ability to learn and grow in those areas.
Yeah. I think there's a real vulnerability in owning inside of ourselves, facing ourselves, the truth of who we are. The truth is, I've really hurt you. That feels vulnerable for me to hold.
Well, you're having a conversation about the truth of who we are and the truth of what we've done.
Yep.
And those are two different things. The truth of who I am is super vulnerable because the truth of who I am is rooted in what God has to say about the beauty of me apart from my actions.
Yeah.
That's vulnerable to even engage that and scary. Then the truth of what I have done is terrifying because it's got so much judgment around it and things that I have to come to terms with and actually learn how to take ownership for. Like I did make a mess and I do have to make amends inside of this world. And it's going to require, if I begin the process of being vulnerable here inside of myself, it means I have 10,000 potential vulnerable moments that I now have to act on, whether that's a dream that I have to make happen, or it's ownership that I have to take and amends that I have to begin to make, hard conversations, or humility that I have to engage with. So again, a lot of people go, I don't want to start the first part of that journey, which is that internal vulnerability, because the outward vulnerability that will come after it. But the benefit is a life well lived.
Yeah. And you can grow tolerance for things. So like the more you practice vulnerability, the more you'll end up seeing the beauty of it, the gift of it, all the times it does work out. And then it gets easier and easier to be vulnerable in different ways. And then you feel less vulnerable all the time. And so this is just your reminder to have courage to start doing that. It's one of the reasons people love doing our courses in groups, because their whole community, their whole family will learn a new way to connect and a new way to relate. And if you're there and you're like, I want to learn how to be more vulnerable and be in a place that feels safe to be vulnerable, we want to invite you to do the immersion course with us. But also we want to challenge you, find a way this week to be vulnerable. Whether you label your vulnerability, whether you tell someone, it's really hard for me to get help when I need it, or it's really hard for me to face this thing, whatever that is, or it's really hard for me to share that I'm really struggling with this insecurity, or I'm really, whatever the thing is that you're weak. Find one person that you feel safe with and let them know, hey, I'm purposely wanting to engage in vulnerability and go a little bit deeper in my relationships. Could I share something with you that I'm processing?
That's good.
And I normally say, can I share something with you that I'm processing that has nothing to do with you? Because most people's anxiety goes up when you say, can I share something with you?
Yeah. The other thing is, on the last note that I made, becoming vulnerable with ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
I think that
it also gets easier. The more you practice being vulnerable with yourself, the less panicky emotions you have about it.
I think a good question to ask ourselves is just simply starting here. Is there one thing that I'm avoiding being vulnerable with myself about? That's it. Just right there. One thing. And give yourself a week to think on that and sit and ask yourself, why do I not want to be vulnerable with that? Why do I not want to look honestly?
Why do I not want to feel that? Why do I want to avoid that?
What are the repercussions of that behavior if I actually get vulnerable with that? And I think that, again, that's part of building basis for a self-awareness. When did I decide that I couldn't be vulnerable with this? And then you can begin to go, oh, okay, I make more sense. My story makes sense. And do I want to change this? That's a great starting point.
Yeah. I was thinking about even in marriage, we've had different seasons where it felt really comfortable being vulnerable, and then seasons where it felt less comfortable being vulnerable. And I just want to say, whatever friendship you're at, wherever it's at, wherever it's been, whatever the history, you can always start to grow towards something now.
Yeah.
You can always be like, I'd like to grow our ability to be more vulnerable. And you can start off with small bites. Like, let's say that me and you, this isn't true, but let's say me and you were not vulnerable about anything. I'd probably start off with small bites. I'd probably start off with something that wasn't about you.
Yeah.
I'd probably start off with something that was vulnerable about another, like a friendship I was processing, or about a fear I had, or a dream I had. I'd probably start off with something small, vulnerable, and then tell you it was vulnerable, and then allow you to be kind. And because small things can grow. Oftentimes, if you try to be too vulnerable too fast, then you'll close back up stronger. Like, you'll close back up tighter. If somebody doesn't respond well, you will lock it down forever. You'll be like, see, vulnerability doesn't work. I'm out.
Yeah. I think that the last thing I'll say as we wrap this up is that if you're listening to this podcast and you're going like, hey, I'm learning vulnerability myself. I want more vulnerability in certain relationships, but I don't know, again, how to fully initiate that, as we're kind of pushing you towards it. I think it might be a really good starting point to just say to the people that you want to be more vulnerable with, hey, let's listen to this vulnerability podcast.
And then let's talk about it.
Let's investigate it. Let's talk about our fears and our insecurities around being vulnerable, what we feel is difficult, and use this as a launching point. You could listen to it with a group of people or family.
For the whole sake of using it as launching points.
Use it. And it'll help you from that point forward.
Yeah.
And then you can blame us for any problems you have in your vulnerability. Aww. It's all Justin and Abby's fault.
Yeah.
They suggested I get vulnerable.
Yeah. Get vulnerable only to the level you can handle it, always.
Yeah.
That's my one last thing.
Yeah. Don't shame yourself if you can't go any further. And
celebrate every step towards vulnerability you do.
Yeah. And I think last but not least, I have this fantastic Bob Ross coffee mug that I got. I just love it. And on the back of it, it says, we don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents. And it has nothing
I can hear him saying that.
I don't know that it has a lot to do with this conversation, but I kept thinking,
good ending point.
We don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents. Well, we do make mistakes, but they can be happy accidents. Anyways, I love Bob Ross's hair. And I think that's the last thing we should think about. Is Justin's ADD is thinking about Bob Ross's hair.
And how you wish you had it.
Yeah. Crazy Bob Ross hair. I'd take that.
Yeah, you would.
Anyways. All right. Anything
I
else?
wouldn't prefer. I prefer the bald head over Bob Ross hair.
It's pretty out of control, his hair.
But I just love. I
just
love.
so happy.
I love your bald head so much.
I love it too.
Yeah.
But it would be fun to have a crazy Bob Ross afro.
Okay.
All right. Anything else?
Here's a testimony that you guys might want to hear.
When you guys talked about the victim mentality, the fact of like anywhere you feel like you don't have options is how you find it. And that's a lot of my panic attacks were feeling trapped. And I had no idea how like trapped I'd felt in life. The more that I am finding that, I'm having less panic, which is great.
Yes.
Come on.
I'm not stuck. And I'm connected enough to my body now that I can actually feel in the panic what it's wanting to do, which I didn't have before either. So like I want to go for a walk. Oh, my body wants to curl up with some love. I actually can hear, which I did not have at all before. And I like the love in this community has been excessively restorative for me. Massive growth for the last 6 months.
The fact that the people who are all here are choosing to engage love, that's a testament of who the people are here within this space who are choosing really the heartbeat of heaven for themselves and for the people around them. I'm just in awe of the high caliber people in here. All right. Peace out.